My name is Jenna, and I'm 29 years old, and for months, I was the girl forced to sit by the door. I still remember my first day at the firm like it was yesterday, the smell of coffee, the sound of hurried footsteps, and the way everyone seemed too busy to notice the new girl standing awkwardly with a hopeful smile. I had just landed a receptionist position at a mid-sized marketing firm in downtown Chicago. For me, it wasn't just a job. It was a new beginning after years of struggling to find stability. I walked in wearing my best blazer, clutching a folder of credentials that I thought would impress someone, but no one cared. My assigned spot wasn't an actual desk. It was a small table squeezed beside the glass entrance, half a meter from where the door swung open every few minutes. Every time someone walked in, the cold draft hit my legs, scattering my papers and freezing my fingers. It felt temporary, at least I hoped it was. The manager who showed me around, a tall woman named Clarice, brushed it off with a polite smile. "Just for now," she said. "We'll set you up properly once your workspace is free." Days turned into weeks. The desk by the door became permanent. I watched as new employees came in after me and were immediately assigned proper cubicles with comfortable chairs. Mine, on the other hand, remained by the entrance, the first face people saw and the last one they ignored. It was humiliating in a way that only quiet neglect can be. I wasn't being yelled at or openly insulted, but the message was clear. I didn't matter. People walked past me with their coffees, their laughter, and their confidence. Sometimes they'd drop off trash on my table as if it were a side counter. Others would ask me to handle their printing or coffee orders because I was already near the front. I told myself it didn't matter, that my position didn't define my potential. But each time the door opened and cold air hit my back, it reminded me of how disposable I was to them. It wasn't just physical discomfort, it was psychological erosion. Being placed by that door made me feel like I was on the outside of everything, even when I was technically in the room. During meetings, my name wasn't called. My ideas weren't asked for. When I tried to contribute, Clarice or one of her assistants would smile politely and say, "Thanks, Jenna, we'll take it from here." Doing small tasks that weren't mine just to feel useful. Filing, organizing, fixing schedules. But no matter how much I did, the next morning, I was still the girl by the door. One afternoon, while I was finishing up a report no one had asked for, I overheard Clarice talking to two of her team members, Brianna and Chloe. They were laughing, sipping iced lattes, unaware that I could hear them through the glass partition. "Honestly, Jenna's perfect for that spot," Clarice said. "She's like a piece of furniture, quiet and decorative." The words stung so sharply I felt my throat tighten. Brianna laughed, replying, "Yeah. The door girl. Every office needs one." Their laughter echoed down the hall, bouncing right back to where I sat. I remember gripping my pen so tightly that the plastic cracked. I wanted to storm in there and tell them off, but I didn't. I just kept typing, pretending not to hear. Because I knew that if I lost control, they'd label me as emotional, and they'd win. So I smiled the next morning when Clarice passed by and said, "Good morning, Jenna. How's our sunshine today?" I smiled because it was safer than letting her see the storm inside me. But deep down, I was changing. The humiliation that once weakened me was beginning to sharpen something far more dangerous: focus. Every time someone ignored me, I learned something about their arrogance. Every insult Clarice made added a brick to the quiet wall I was building inside my mind. I started noticing things. The way she arrived late to meetings but still took credit for others' work. How Brianna disappeared for hours and returned with reports she clearly didn't write. How Chloe flirted with the manager from accounting to get her numbers approved. They thought I was invisible. But invisibility has its advantages. You see everything. You hear everything. And no one guards their secrets when they think you're beneath them. At night, I would go home and replay every interaction in my head. My tiny apartment felt like a war room where I quietly stored every detail, every slight, every weakness I'd observed. I didn't have a plan yet, just awareness, but that was enough. There's a strange kind of power in being underestimated. When people don't see you coming, they never prepare for what you're capable of. That door they made me sit beside it wasn't just an entryway anymore. It became a symbol, a reminder of where they placed me, and where I'd make them end up. I didn't know it yet, But they had just chosen the wrong girl to underestimate. It wasn't just the chair, it was the people around it that made it unbearable. Once I settled into my role, if you could call sitting by the door settling, I began to see the firm for what it really was. A high school with salaries. Cliques, gossip, alliances, and egos ran the place more than the official workflow did. And the ringleader of it all was Clarice. Clarice was the kind of woman who made heads turn the moment she walked in, not because of her charm, but because of the storm she carried with her. She was polished, powerful, and poisonous. At 36, she was the head of marketing and knew exactly how to control the narrative. Her smile was strategic, her compliments calculated. She loved being feared. And she loved knowing everyone needed her approval to breathe comfortably in that office. Then there were her shadows, Brianna and Chloe. Brianna, her assistant, was the self-proclaimed social butterfly who flitted around collecting gossip like nectar. She wore too much perfume, too little professionalism, and never missed a chance to throw someone under the bus if it earned her a laugh from Clarice. Chloe, on the other hand, was quiet but conniving. She had a way of pretending to be kind until she got what she wanted. Together, they were inseparable, a trio of office predators disguised as professionals. It started small. Brianna would accidentally misplace my printed reports before meetings. Chloe would correct me in front of others for things I didn't even do wrong. And Clarice, she didn't need to say much. All it took was one disapproving glance from her to make the room shift its tone toward me. Whenever someone came into the office, they'd joke, "Oh, there's Jenna by the door, always ready to greet." And Clarice would chuckle softly, replying, "She's part of the decor now." Those laughs were sharper than any insult. At first, I tried to ignore them. I kept telling myself that if I worked hard enough, they'd see my worth. I stayed late, took initiative, and even volunteered to help with the firm's social media analytics. But every time I handed in a report, it ended up with Clarice's name on it. Every time I offered an idea, it was dismissed, until one of them repeated it in a meeting and suddenly it was brilliant. It wasn't incompetence that got rewarded there, it was manipulation. One day, Brianna approached me with a sugary smile. "Hey Jenna, Clarice needs those client files as soon as possible. Can you run them up to her?" I nodded, grateful to be useful. But when I entered the meeting room, Clarice looked up with that cold smirk and said, "Oh, how thoughtful of you to interrupt an important meeting. Next time, maybe wait until you're invited." Laughter erupted from around the table. My face burned, and I muttered an apology before stepping out. I stood by the door for a few seconds, fighting tears. That's when I realized they didn't just dislike me, they enjoyed making me feel small. But what they didn't know was that I was done being their target. I started noticing their patterns. Clarice never stayed late, she had others finish her work. Brianna kept tabs on who talked to whom. And Chloe, the quiet one, was the bridge between gossip and execution. She spread Clarice's words to others, shaping opinions like smoke slipping through cracks. I wasn't just working anymore. I was studying them. I learned that Clarice had built her power not through results, but through relationships. She had a hold on upper management, mainly because she presented herself as indispensable. She had a way of making every success seem like her doing, and every failure someone else's fault. But I also noticed cracks, the way she overpromised to clients. The way she delegated key tasks to people like Brianna, who weren't detail-oriented enough to handle them. The way she relied on fear to keep everyone compliant. And the more I saw, the more I realized that the three of them weren't untouchable, they were just unchallenged. I started keeping a journal, jotting down dates, comments, and interactions. Not because I planned revenge yet, but because I needed clarity. Every line I wrote reminded me I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. They really were trying to crush me. One morning, as I walked in, Clarice waved me over with her manicured hand. "Jenna, we're having a department photo today," she said sweetly. "You'll stand right here." She pointed to a spot behind the group, half hidden by the office plant near the door. Everyone laughed as I awkwardly took my place. The photographer hesitated, whispering, "Maybe she should move a bit forward?" Clarice replied smoothly, "No, this is perfect. She represents our front-facing team, right by the door. Click. The camera captured it, the forced smile on my face and the smug one on hers. That picture later went on the firm's website. I was literally the shadow in the background. That night, as I stared at that image on the screen, something inside me hardened. The part of me that wanted approval died quietly, and something colder took its place. From that moment, I stopped trying to fit in. I stopped hoping they'd see my worth. I decided I'd make them see something else entirely, the consequences of underestimating me. I started greeting everyone warmly, as usual. But behind the smile, my mind was collecting data, mapping connections, and observing weaknesses. And whenever Clarice made one of her smug jokes about Jenna by the door, I would just nod and say softly, "Yes, Clarice, always by the door." She thought I was agreeing. But in my head, the words meant something else entirely. Because one day, when the time came, I'd be the one standing by the door, watching her walk out for good. They thought I was silent because I was weak, not knowing silence was the sound of my strategy forming. Everyone has a limit, and mine came on a Friday morning that began like any other. That Friday morning started like hundreds before it, me unlocking the office door, setting out the morning mail, and turning on the coffee machine before anyone else arrived. I remember thinking, just get through today, Jenna. It was the end of the week, and I was already emotionally exhausted from the endless microaggressions, snide remarks, and fake smiles. Clarice was running a big presentation for a new client that day, a campaign proposal that could bring in major revenue for the firm. What no one in that office seemed to remember was that I had been the one building the foundation for it. I had stayed late every night that week, crafting the slides, fine-tuning the data, and aligning the visuals. Clarice barely reviewed it. She simply told me, "Make it shine, I'll take care of the rest." By take care, she meant she'd deliver it as her own work. I didn't expect her to give me credit. I never did. But what happened that day crossed a line I didn't even know I had. The boardroom was full, the directors, the senior managers, and the client. A confident man in a gray suit who seemed impressed by the setup. Clarice strutted in 10 minutes late, as usual, holding her coffee and pretending she'd been up all night working. I stood quietly at the back, clutching my notepad, ready to help if needed. She began the presentation. Every word, every slide, every chart mine. I recognized my phrasing, my examples, even the title I'd agonized over. The client nodded approvingly and said, "That's an excellent angle, Clarice. You really understand our vision." Clarice smiled, her voice syrupy sweet. "Thank you." I always try to personalize each campaign. My heart pounded so hard I thought someone might hear it. After the meeting, everyone congratulated her. She basked in their praise, tossing her hair, saying things like, "Teamwork makes the dream work." I stood nearby, holding the stack of printed materials like an accessory to her glory. Then she turned to me, in front of the entire team, and said, "Oh, Jenna, you can take these old reports and file them where they belong by the door." The room erupted in laughter. Even the client chuckled, assuming it was a harmless joke. Something in me cracked. I took the stack from her, my hands trembling, and walked out of the room as quietly as I could. I didn't go to the file room. I went straight to the bathroom. The second the door shut behind me, I dropped the papers on the counter and gripped the edge of the sink. My reflection stared back, tired eyes, smudged eyeliner, and a woman who had spent too long letting people walk over her. I felt my chest tighten as humiliation turned into something else, a raw, burning rage that I had been suppressing for months. I whispered to myself, "No more." It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was final. I thought about every night I'd stayed late. Every smile I'd forced. Every insult I'd swallowed. I thought about how many times I'd told myself that if I just worked harder, they'd see my value. They never would. People like Clarice didn't see value, they saw opportunity to exploit it. And in that moment, I realized something powerful. They had taken advantage of my patience, my kindness, and my silence, but they couldn't take my intelligence or my memory. When I walked out of that restroom, I wasn't the same person who had entered. My shoulders straightened, my walk slowed, my eyes were sharper. I passed Clarice in the hallway. She didn't even glance at me. She was too busy chatting with Brianna, probably celebrating her successful meeting. I smiled to myself. Because for the first time, I wasn't angry that she didn't notice me, I was counting on it. That afternoon, while the office buzzed with chatter, I sat by my little desk, typing quietly. But I wasn't doing administrative work anymore. I was writing an outline, a map of everything I had seen, heard, and experienced in that place. Every lie, every insult, every stolen credit. I didn't know exactly what I'd do with it yet, but I knew I was going to do something. When Clarice passed by me that evening, she smirked and said, "Still here, Jenna? You really love this spot, don't you?" I looked up at her and replied calmly, "Yes. It's got a perfect view of everyone coming and going." She laughed, not realizing the weight behind my words. That night, as I locked up and turned off the lights, the reflection in the glass door caught my attention. I stared at myself, not the girl who was humiliated, but the woman who had finally decided to fight back. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't just survive their cruelty anymore, I would outsmart it. That door they made me sit beside had always felt like a barrier between me and the rest of the office. But standing there, with my reflection staring back, it hit me maybe that door wasn't keeping me out. Maybe it was showing me the exit I'd eventually make them take. That was the day I decided I wouldn't just get even, I'd rewrite the entire power structure. Revenge doesn't start with shouting, it starts with silence. After that Friday, I didn't quit. I know most people would have. Some might have walked out that day, screaming, crying, or begging for justice that would never come. But I'd learned something about power. It's rarely taken by those who make the most noise. It's taken by the ones who know when to listen, observe, and strike when no one sees them coming. So, I became quiet. Not the broken kind of quiet they expected from me, but the calculating kind. Clarice still strutted through the office as if she were untouchable. But I noticed something new. She had started making mistakes. Her overconfidence blinded her. She stopped double-checking reports, forwarded sensitive emails without reading them, and assumed everyone was too afraid to question her. And that's where my plan began to take shape. It started with Nolan. Nolan was the IT technician, a quiet, unassuming guy in his early 30s with a calm presence and a sharp mind. He'd seen his share of office politics, mostly from behind his computer screens. He was the kind of man who fixed problems and minded his own business, which made him invisible to people like Clarice. I approached him one afternoon under the guise of a simple computer issue. "Hey Nolan, my email keeps lagging. Could you take a look?" He nodded and sat down beside me, tapping away at the keyboard. As he worked, I leaned in slightly and whispered, "You ever notice how some people here don't exactly play fair?" He looked up briefly, smirked, and said quietly, "You mean Clarice?" That single word confirmed everything I needed to know. From that moment on, Nolan became my quiet ally. I didn't tell him everything, but enough that he understood I was gathering information. Over time, he started helping me piece together the puzzle behind Clarice's success. Through access logs, email metadata, and internal files, we found something interesting. Clarice had been manipulating campaign results. She wasn't just taking credit for other people's work, she was altering numbers to make her projects appear more profitable than they really were. The inflated metrics made her look like a star in the eyes of upper management. We didn't act right away. We documented everything. Screenshots, timestamps, email trails, proof so undeniable that no amount of charm could talk her way out of it. But I didn't stop there. While Nolan handled the technical side, I worked on the human side. I began talking to my coworkers, gently, subtly. I didn't complain or gossip, I asked questions. I became a listener, a sympathetic ear to those who had been wronged or overlooked. And it turned out, there were many. People began confiding in me how Clarice had stolen their work, dismissed their complaints, or made them feel insignificant. Each story was another thread in the web I was quietly weaving. At the same time, I adjusted how I behaved. I no longer reacted to Clarice's provocations. When she mocked me or dismissed me, I smiled politely. When she dumped extra work on me, I said, "Of course," with a tone so calm it unnerved her. My silence began to confuse her. Brianna and Chloe noticed it too. They would exchange glances whenever I didn't flinch at their jokes. The power dynamic was shifting, even if they couldn't articulate why. I wasn't the desperate girl seeking approval anymore. I was the calm shadow they couldn't read. And that terrified people like them. Each day I sat by that same door, but it no longer felt like a punishment. It was a position of observation, a vantage point. I saw every interaction, heard every whisper, and noted who aligned with whom. I knew when Clarice lied, when Brianna exaggerated, and when Chloe manipulated. They thought they were running the office, but in reality, they were exposing themselves to the one person who was truly paying attention. At night, when the building emptied, I stayed behind. I'd walk through the quiet halls, imagining what this place would look like without them in it, how peaceful it could be. I wasn't dreaming of chaos anymore. I was imagining order. One evening, Nolan joined me after everyone left. He leaned against the doorway of my tiny corner and said, "You're building a case, aren't you?" I met his eyes and said softly, "No. I'm building a future." He nodded, understanding perfectly. Over the next few weeks, I refined everything. Every lie Clarice told was documented. Every fabricated report was preserved. Every person she had hurt would eventually have a voice. I didn't tell anyone what I planned. The best revenge doesn't need an audience, it needs precision. And while Clarice continued to treat me like background noise, I sat there, typing away at my desk by the door, smiling just enough to make her think I'd given up. But in reality, I was just getting started. Because revenge, I'd learned, doesn't come from anger. It comes from patience. It comes from watching long enough to see exactly where someone's arrogance will lead them, and being ready to let them fall all on their own. They thought I was just sitting still, but I was planting the seeds of their downfall. The more you watch people, the more they tell on themselves. I learned early that offices are ecosystems and everyone, no matter how loud or quiet, plays a role in keeping it alive. From my seat by the door, I watched patterns form like tide lines on sand, predictable, telling, and impossible to erase once you paid attention. I watched Clarice's arrogance bloom into mistakes, and every mistake she made left behind clues. I watched Brianna's habit of disappearing for lunch that stretched into entire afternoons, and when she returned, reports full of errors magically appeared with her name on them. I watched Chloe, who pretended to be oblivious, slip up when she forwarded a private message to the wrong person. I wrote down dates and times in a little spiral notebook I kept hidden in my drawer, and slowly, imperceptibly, a map emerged. I started volunteering for small cross-department tasks that Clarice ignored because they didn't seem glamorous, reconciling a dataset with accounting, proofreading a pitch deck from legal, consolidating a client feedback spreadsheet from sales. Doing those invisible jobs gave me access to the corridors of information Clarice thought were locked to her. I noticed who actually did the work on the campaigns she took credit for, who corrected her sloppy spreadsheets, and who quietly redid her hastily written copy at 3 a.m. People began trusting me in small ways because I listened and didn't judge. A junior designer told me once, over a microwaved leftover dinner, that Clarice took her layouts and presented them as creative direction. A senior account manager confessed, after a couple of beers at a work event, that Clarice promised metrics she couldn't possibly deliver. Each confession was a small shard of the larger truth. I never pressed. I let people talk. They wanted someone to hear them, someone who didn't have a position to lose or a boss to appease. Because of that, they forgot to filter their words, and their words became evidence. I started cataloging not just emails and files with Nolan but also human notes. Who was afraid, who was angry, who had been burned and would be willing to testify. The office gossip that once felt like acid on my skin became a fountain of details. I learned which managers were indifferent, which ones were susceptible to flattery, and which ones loved numbers more than people. Clarice depended on those managers' blind spots. She excelled at presenting stories that sounded like strategy but were just clever smoke and mirrors. She was brilliant at rehearsed confidence but terrible at showing her work. I began to pick apart her rehearsed lines by keeping track of the source materials she reused. A phrase from the design brief copied into her speech, a chart from a competitor's report repackaged as original insight. She assumed no one paid attention to the crumbs. I did. I also began testing the office's reaction thresholds. I would mention a tiny inconsistency in a meeting, nothing overt, just a quiet question about a number's source, and watch faces change. Some people steered away, afraid to be pulled into conflict. Others, surprised, would fumble for an answer and reveal their complicity. Those microtests taught me who would stand with me when the time came and who would fold like cheap cardboard. Meanwhile, the door beside me changed meaning daily. Once, it marked my exclusion. Then it became an observation post. Now, it felt like the hinge of the entire building, everything passed through it. Everyone showed their true face in the moment they entered or left. The trivial conversations at the threshold were the ones that mattered most. Pre-meeting boasts, offhand apologies, the casual assignment of blame when a deadline was missed. I started bringing a second notebook, this one dedicated to small behavioral notes. Who lied when flustered, who redirected blame, who suddenly became helpful when a director was near. Those patterns told stories louder than any email ever could. I used those stories to nudge people subtly. When someone confided, I made a point of referring to their contribution in a public update, a line in an email, or a compliment in passing to managers. Those small acknowledgments were seeds of validation that undermined Clarice's narrative of indispensability. People started to remember that they had value independent of her approval. As the weeks turned into months and my dossiers filled up with both digital proof and human testimony, small cracks began to appear in Clarice's armor. She grew more careless in panic. She started delegating even more recklessly, thinking speed would cover scrutiny. Brianna grew sloppy in her attempts to keep up, and Chloe's careful filtering faltered. The arrogance that had once made them untouchable made them careless, and the more careless they got, the clearer the evidence became. From my vantage point, I could see the dominoes lining up, and for the first time since I'd been seated by that door, I felt something that wasn't fear or pain, it was anticipation. Soon, that door would swing open, and the right people would walk out permanently. The higher they climbed on lies, the harder I prepared their fall. Clarice's arrogance had reached its peak. The company was thriving, or at least, that's what upper management believed. Her team looked successful on paper, the numbers sparkled, and her confidence blinded everyone to the truth beneath. She had built her empire on stolen credit, falsified reports, and manipulation, and no one dared to challenge her, except me. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One afternoon, Clarice called me into her office, her tone dripping with forced politeness. "Jenna, I have a very special project for you, a confidential one." That word confidential was her favorite way of saying, "I'll use you and then blame you if it goes wrong." I sat across from her sleek glass desk as she explained. The firm was pitching a high-profile campaign for a luxury skincare brand. "We need precise numbers, budget projections, client research, all polished and perfect," she said, waving her manicured hand. "You're good at details, right? Make sure everything looks clean." I nodded, my face calm, my mind already spinning. I worked overnight on those projections. Every chart, every financial figure, every word was meticulous. But this time, I added something small, subtle, traceable. The kind of discrepancies that would only show up under scrutiny, the kind that would tie directly back to her when she inevitably edited the file and presented it as her own. It wasn't sabotage. It was accountability, wrapped in precision. The next morning, I handed her the file on a flash drive. "All done," I said. "Everything's in order." She smiled, the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "Good girl." 2 days later, during the board presentation, Clarice strutted in as usual, exuding confidence. She pitched the proposal flawlessly, or so she thought. She didn't realize that her final version contained her own revisions, the ones she made without checking the formulas. Those revisions created inconsistencies in the financial data that were impossible to explain away. When the director of finance raised an eyebrow and asked, "Clarice, these figures don't align with the previous quarter's margins. Can you clarify the discrepancy?" She froze. For the first time, she didn't have an answer. I was sitting outside the boardroom, pretending to type an email, but I could hear every word through the thin walls. Her voice, usually smooth and controlled, trembled. I'll have to double-check that." she said weakly. The meeting ended awkwardly. The directors weren't pleased. Later that day, she stormed out of her office, her heels clicking furiously on the floor, and cornered me by the door. "Did you mess with those numbers?" she hissed. I looked her dead in the eye. "I gave you exactly what you asked for." She glared at me for a long moment, trying to read the calm on my face. Then she snapped, "Next time, check your work twice," before storming off. But she didn't realize her panic had already begun to unravel. Her power. That one mistake sent a ripple through the company. People whispered. Questions were asked. Suddenly, the woman who had seemed untouchable was under quiet scrutiny. Brianna and Chloe, sensing the shift, started to distance themselves. I could see the cracks in their alliance forming. They stopped lunching together. They started blaming each other for missed deadlines. Loyalty built on fear is fragile, it breaks the moment safety disappears. Nolan and I watched the chaos unfold. We didn't push. We let gravity do the work. A week later, HR began reviewing campaign data after minor discrepancies were reported. I didn't have to submit anything. I'd already made sure the trail pointed where it needed to. The truth was hiding in plain sight, and Clarice's own ego had delivered it straight to the auditors. Meanwhile, I played the role of the quiet employee doing her job. I smiled at everyone, greeted Clarice politely, and acted oblivious to the whispers following her. She was unraveling from the inside out, paranoid, snapping at people, sending angry late-night emails. One morning, Brianna came up to me at the coffee machine. "Do you know if Clarice is okay?" she asked, voice low. I shrugged. "I'm sure she's fine. She always is." But she wasn't fine. For the first time, she was losing control. Then came the meeting that sealed her fate. Upper management called her in to clarify inconsistencies in her reports. I saw her pacing the hallway before going in, adjusting her blazer, trying to look composed. The meeting lasted over an hour. When she finally emerged, her face was pale, her hands trembling. She didn't even look at me when she passed. By the next day, her tone had changed entirely. No more arrogance, no more fake charm. Just a cold, fearful silence. I didn't celebrate, I didn't gloat. I kept my expression neutral as always. But inside, I knew this was only the beginning. One dent in her reputation wasn't enough. I wanted the entire rotten structure she'd built to collapse. And the best part? She was going to do most of the destroying herself. Because once fear starts whispering in a manipulator's ear, they begin turning on everyone around them. And that's exactly what happened. Clarice accused Brianna of negligence, blamed Chloe for forgetting to verify data, and claimed her team had failed her. In doing so, she alienated the only two people who had ever defended her. For the first time, Clarice looked nervous, and I wasn't done yet. Revenge isn't just about payback, it's about transformation. By the time Clarice's confidence began to crumble, the office atmosphere had changed. People spoke in hushed tones now. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Even the directors, who once greeted her with admiration, started addressing her with polite formality. The cracks were visible, small at first, but widening with every passing day. I watched from my usual seat by the door, calm and unreadable. It was strange how much power silence could have. Clarice used to think my quietness was submission, but now, it unsettled her. I could see it in the way she glanced at me sometimes, eyes narrowed, suspicious but uncertain. She knew something was happening, but she couldn't prove it. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. HR called me in for a quick chat. The HR manager, a middle-aged woman named Linda, smiled as she gestured for me to sit. "Jenna, we're doing a little follow-up on the recent financial inconsistencies in the marketing department," she said, her tone gentle but probing. "Since you've been helping with some of the administrative work, we were wondering if you noticed anything unusual." I pretended to hesitate. "I'm not sure what would count as unusual," I said softly. "Clarice usually handles those reports herself. Sometimes she asks me to format them, but I don't see the data before she edits it." Linda nodded, scribbling notes. "That's helpful. Thank you." I smiled politely and left, keeping my face composed even though my pulse was racing. HR had confirmed what I wanted. They were digging. When I returned to my desk, I found Nolan waiting near the coffee station. He caught my eye and mouthed, "They're on it." That evening, after everyone left, Nolan and I sat in the glow of our monitors, reviewing the folder of evidence we'd gathered. Emails, spreadsheets, fake budgets, client correspondence, all of it. We had everything. But now it wasn't just about Clarice. It was about the culture that let her thrive. The directors who ignored complaints, the HR that dismissed mistreatment, the coworkers who laughed instead of helping. I didn't just want Clarice gone, I wanted accountability. We built a dossier, a complete timeline showing her manipulation, fraud, and mistreatment of employees. It was clean, organized, undeniable. Nolan helped me encrypt it, ensuring it couldn't be altered or traced back to us until we wanted it to be. The next morning, I acted as though nothing had changed. I made copies, sorted files, and answered phones like always. Clarice stormed past me without saying a word, her expression tight. Word had spread that an internal review was underway. The energy in the office shifted from anxiety to anticipation. People sensed something coming. That week, the directors scheduled a department meeting. Clarice stood at the head of the table, trying to appear composed. But when they began asking questions, specific pointed questions, her mask started slipping. "Clarice," the financial director said, tapping the papers in front of him, "these campaign figures don't match the reports you submitted last quarter. Can you explain the discrepancy?" Clarice stammered. "There must have been a formatting issue. Maybe one of my assistants." "Your assistant only formats the visuals," he interrupted. "The numbers come from you." The room went silent. I sat in the corner, taking notes as usual. My heart thudded in my chest, but my face remained calm. Brianna shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Chloe stared down at her phone, pretending not to exist. No one spoke up for Clarice. Not one person. When the meeting ended, Clarice brushed past me without a word. Her perfume sharp and bitter in the air. Later that day, I saw her door closed, a rarity. She was unraveling behind it. Alone. That evening, Nolan sent me a message. "It's time." We attached the dossier to an anonymous email addressed to the company's legal department and board of directors. The subject line read, "Internal fraud and workplace misconduct evidence attached." We sent it and said nothing. The next morning, chaos erupted. HR summoned Clarice before she even sat down. Whispers spread through the office like wildfire. Chloe was pale. Brianna was crying in the break room. No one knew who sent the evidence, but everyone knew the truth had come out. By noon, Clarice's office was empty. Her nameplate was gone. The directors sent out a company-wide email announcing an ongoing investigation into serious ethical violations. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just sat at my desk, tapping my pen softly, letting the hum of the office wash over me. When I finally got up to make a cup of coffee, people actually looked at me, really looked at me for the first time. No one laughed. No one joked about the girl by the door. As I walked back to my seat, Nolan passed by and murmured, "Looks like you finally got your view." I glanced toward the empty hallway that led to Clarice's office. The silence there was sweeter than any apology I could have received. I didn't destroy her. I revealed her. There's a difference. She built her kingdom on deception, and I simply held up a mirror until she couldn't stand her own reflection. For months, I had been invisible, sitting by the door they thought was my punishment. Now that same door felt like the front line of victory, the point where everything changed. But this time, when they looked at me, they finally saw me, and that was only the beginning. When a storm hits, the ones who built on lies crumble first. The Monday after Clarice's removal felt like walking into an entirely different office. The air was still heavy. But it wasn't with arrogance anymore, it was uncertainty. The people who used to strut through the hallways whispering about others were now whispering about themselves. Every conversation was hushed, every door half closed. No one knew how deep the investigation went, or who might be called in next. Clarice's glass-walled office sat empty, her name stripped from the door. Her expensive perfume still lingered in the air, a faint ghost of control. No one dared to sit in her chair. Even the cleaning crew avoided the space. It felt cursed, like a monument to everything rotten that had been hiding behind glossy presentations and forced smiles. Brianna was the first to crack. She came into work late, eyes red and puffy, her usual bright lipstick replaced by pale silence. She tried to act as though nothing had changed, but the tremble in her hands gave her away. I caught her once staring at Clarice's old office with a look that was more fear than sadness. Chloe, on the other hand, turned ice cold. She walked around like she was already planning her exit. Rumor had it she'd been questioned by HR about leaked internal communications. I didn't need to guess where that lead came from. Clarice had thrown her under the bus before the ink on her suspension papers had even dried. Poetic justice. I didn't celebrate any of it out loud, though. Outwardly, I was the same old Jenna, calm, polite, professional. I still sat by the door, still greeted everyone as they came in, still offered to help when needed. But now, there was something different in the way people looked at me. It wasn't pity anymore, it was respect. Colleagues who once ignored me began stopping by to ask small questions. "Hey Jenna, do you remember the client feedback from last month? Or, could you double-check this number before I send it off?" They trusted my precision now. They wanted my insight. I didn't ask for it. I'd earned it through endurance. Then came the moment that surprised even me. The company's managing director, Mr. Hawthorne, a man who'd never once spoken to me directly before, called me into his office. He looked exhausted, rubbing his temples as he motioned for me to sit. "Jenna," he began slowly. "First, I want to thank you for your cooperation during all this." I nodded, staying neutral. "Of course," he sighed. "You've been with us for nearly 2 years, correct?" "Yes, sir." "Well," he said, leaning back, "you've handled yourself with professionalism throughout a very difficult period. I've had several employees mention how dependable you are." That startled me. For the first time, the word dependable didn't sound like a dismissal, it sounded like acknowledgement. He continued, "We'll be restructuring the marketing department for a while. During the interim, we'll need someone organized to help coordinate between teams while we reassess leadership roles. I'd like you to handle that, if you're willing." It took me a moment to process what he was saying. Me, the girl who sat by the door, was being asked to help manage coordination for the entire department. I kept my voice steady. "I'd be happy to." He nodded approvingly. "Good. I knew we could count on you." When I stepped out of his office, the hallway felt different. For months, I had walked those floors like a ghost, unseen and unheard. Now, as I passed people, they greeted me. Not with fake smiles, but with sincerity. Still, I didn't let it get to my head. I knew how fragile workplace respect could be. People weren't loyal to individuals, they were loyal to comfort. And now that Clarice was gone, I had become the new comfort. Quiet stability in the aftermath of chaos. Nolan congratulated me later that day. "Look at you," he said with a small grin. "Running the show from your corner." I laughed softly. "Just keeping it organized." But we both knew this was more than that. It was the turning point I'd built toward from the moment Clarice first humiliated me. As the days passed, things started to settle into a new rhythm. I rebuilt the schedule system Clarice had let fall apart. I redistributed workloads fairly. People began staying late again, not because they were afraid, but because they cared. The office, for the first time in a long time, felt human. Even HR began acting differently. Linda, the HR manager who once brushed off my complaints, stopped by one morning. "Jenna," she said awkwardly, "I just wanted to say you've handled all of this very gracefully. Not many people could have kept their head through all that." I thanked her politely, but inside, her words landed like irony. She was the same woman who once told me to fit in better. But I didn't correct her. She wasn't worth my energy anymore. Still, as satisfying as it was to see justice unfolding, I knew something was unfinished. Clarice was gone, but the system that had allowed her to thrive remained. I'd watched people like her rise and fall before manipulators, charmers, abusers of authority, and I knew how quickly companies forgot their lessons once the storm passed. If I wanted true closure, I couldn't just expose one woman. I had to ensure no one could ever create another Clarice again. So, I started planning the final step, something that would turn this temporary balance into lasting change. Because my revenge wasn't just about making her fall, it was about reshaping everything that made her possible. Because one major piece of revenge was still unfinished. True closure comes when you stop settling for survival and start writing your own rules. After the investigation wrapped up, the office felt calmer but not whole. Clarice was gone for good, her name scrubbed from the internal network, her old office reassigned as a temporary meeting space. Yet every time I walked past it, I couldn't shake the feeling that her ghost still lingered, whispering through the glass walls like a cautionary tale. Most people were eager to move on. They treated the whole scandal like an unfortunate but distant memory, something to forget as quickly as possible. But I couldn't. I knew that if we just buried what happened, another Clarice would eventually rise. It wasn't about one person, it was about the system that allowed people like her to climb unchecked. So, I decided to finish what I started. The firm had scheduled Clarice's formal hearing with the board of directors, the final review before her termination was publicly filed. I wasn't required to attend, but I had something they needed to see. For weeks, Nolan and I had been organizing the evidence we'd collected, not just of Clarice's fraud, but of her abuse of power. The manipulation, the bullying, the way HR ignored complaints, the unethical favoritism, it was all connected. The more I looked at it, the more I realized it wasn't just her that had failed. It was the entire culture. So, I wrote a report. Not an angry rant or an emotional plea, but a calm, factual, airtight summary of everything that had gone wrong and how to fix it. It was detailed, professional, and strategic. I titled it, Systemic Accountability Proposal, Building Ethical Leadership from the Inside. It didn't accuse, it revealed. I outlined real changes, transparent reporting channels, independent auditing, anonymous employee feedback systems, and most importantly, leadership accountability measures. I included names, dates, witnesses, and supporting evidence for every claim. And at the end of the report, I added a single simple line. This report was compiled by an employee who was once told to fit in better. She did. Nolan helped me package it all neatly, with digital signatures and timestamps, ensuring it couldn't be dismissed as rumor or emotion. The morning of Clarice's hearing, I printed a copy, slipped it into an envelope, and left it on the desk of Mr. Hawthorne, the managing director. I didn't sign it, I didn't need to. By afternoon, the office buzzed with quiet tension. People knew something was happening behind closed doors. I kept working, my hands steady even though my heart wasn't. Later that day, Mr. Hawthorne's assistant came by my desk. He'd like to see you, she said softly. Inside his office, he stood by the window, reading from a familiar-looking folder. He looked up when I entered. This report, he said, holding it slightly aloft, is remarkable. Did you write it? I hesitated for a second, then nodded. Yes, sir. He was silent for a moment. You realize this could change how we operate, how every department functions. That's the point, I said quietly. He nodded slowly, studying me with something between surprise and respect. Clarice's hearing concluded this morning. She's officially terminated, effective immediately. The board is reviewing your recommendations. I exhaled, a tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying finally loosening. Then he added, until we finalize the restructure, we need someone to help oversee the transition. You've shown extraordinary initiative and integrity. I'd like to offer you the interim supervisor position starting immediately. For a moment, I couldn't speak. All I could think about was that cold seat by the door, the years of humiliation, and the countless moments I'd almost walked away. Thank you, I managed to say. I'll do my best. When I returned to my desk, Nolan was waiting, a knowing grin tugging at his mouth. Well? He asked. They gave me her office, I said quietly. He laughed. Ironic, isn't it? I looked over at the empty glass room across the hall. I'm not sure I want it. Then don't take it, he replied. Make it yours. So, I did. The next day, I moved into Clarice's old office not as a trophy, but as a statement. The first thing I did was remove her framed awards and glossy photos. I replaced them with one simple item, a small potted plant I'd kept beside my old desk by the door. Its leaves had grown wild and full despite the shadows it once sat in. That plant was me. As I organized my new workspace, I caught my reflection in the glass wall. For the first time, I didn't see the quiet receptionist or the humiliated woman who was laughed at. I saw a leader one forged through fire, not privilege. Later that week, the board formally approved my proposal. HR was restructured. Employee feedback channels were introduced. Transparency reports became mandatory. Change didn't come overnight, but it came. And with every new policy implemented, I felt a little lighter. When I finally sat down at my desk, I looked toward the door, the same door that had once been my cage, and smiled. That seat by the door suddenly looked like the most powerful position in the room. After destruction comes rebuilding, and it's harder than revenge itself. Becoming interim supervisor wasn't a victory lap, it was a reckoning. For years, I'd been surviving a culture built on fear, favoritism, and silence. Now, for the first time, I had the chance to rebuild that culture from the ground up. But rebuilding wasn't about punishing those who had stayed quiet. It was about showing them there was another way to exist here, one where they didn't have to shrink themselves to be seen. The first week in Clarice's old role was chaos. Everyone was tense, waiting for me to become the next version of her. They'd seen people in power before, and every one of them had eventually turned cruel. So when I called for a department meeting, I could feel the skepticism in the room before I even spoke. I stood at the head of the table, the same spot where Clarice once humiliated me, and took a slow breath. We're not doing things the same way anymore, I said simply. If you have ideas, speak. If you have frustrations, bring them up. No more whispers behind closed doors. A long silence followed. No one wanted to be the first to test my sincerity. Then, a junior designer named Sophia raised her hand hesitantly. Will we actually be heard this time? Her question hit hard. It wasn't defiance, it was fear disguised as doubt. Yes, I said firmly. You will. From that day on, I made it my mission to prove it. I spent hours listening, really listening to every team member. Their stories were painful, familiar, and raw. Some had been overlooked like I was. Others had learned to survive by keeping their heads down. One woman broke down crying, admitting she'd almost quit last year because she couldn't handle the constant criticism. I didn't promise to fix everything overnight, but I did promise one thing: no one would ever be made to feel small for doing their job. Together, we built a new structure. We created open brainstorming sessions where every idea was considered before decisions were made. I set up rotating leadership roles in meetings so no single voice dominated. We introduced anonymous feedback boxes, digital and physical, so people could safely speak their minds. And slowly, the energy changed. The laughter that returned to that office wasn't cruel anymore, it was genuine. Teams stayed late because they cared about the projects, not because they were terrified of consequences. Even deadlines felt lighter, like we were building something that actually mattered. It was hard. Work, exhausting, emotional, and deeply personal. Every time I enforced fairness or encouraged honesty, I could almost hear Clarice's voice mocking me from the past. You'll never last if you play nice. But I wasn't playing nice. I was leading differently. Nolan became my anchor through it all. He wasn't just my partner in the quiet revenge anymore, he was my sounding board. When I doubted myself, he reminded me why I started this. One evening, as we walked out together, he said, "You know, you could have just left after she was fired." I smiled faintly. "And let someone else rebuild this place into another Clarice's playground? No, I'm staying until this place learns better." He nodded. "That's why they'll follow you." In time, they did. Within months, productivity rose, turnover dropped, and for the first time in years, our department received commendations from upper management for teamwork. But more importantly, people smiled again. There was trust, real trust. One morning, As I passed by the reception area, I noticed something that made me stop. A new intern sat by the door right where I once did. She looked nervous, fidgeting with her keyboard, trying not to be in the way. I walked over and smiled. "Hey, do you want to switch seats? There's an open desk closer to the team." Her eyes widened. "Oh, I don't want to bother anyone." "You're not bothering anyone," I said gently. "You belong here as much as anyone else." She smiled, relieved. And in that small moment, I realized something profound. The real revenge wasn't Clarice's downfall. It was that the cycle ended with me. I still kept my old chair, the one that sat by the door. I moved it into my office and placed it in the corner beside the window. It reminded me of where I came from, and how easily power can corrupt perspective if you forget your roots. Sometimes I'd sit in it after hours, lights dimmed, the office quiet. I'd look out over the city and think about how far I'd come from invisible to influential, from underestimated to unshakable. The truth is, rebuilding was harder than revenge ever was. Revenge was fire, it burned fast and bright. But rebuilding? That was patience, compassion, and strength. And as the new culture took hold, I saw something else in the people around me: hope. They didn't fear the door anymore. They didn't see it as a place for punishment or exclusion. It was just another part of the office, neutral, harmless. And for me, that was the greatest victory of all. But life had one more test waiting for me outside that office. Some people can't handle losing, especially to someone they once mocked. It had been 6 months since Clarice's name disappeared from the company roster. 6 months of rebuilding, healing, and learning how to breathe freely again. The storm she left behind had finally cleared, and the office had started to feel like home, not a battlefield. I thought it was over. I thought she was gone for good. But people like Clarice never really disappear, they just wait for the right moment to crawl back into the light. It started with whispers online. One of my team members mentioned that someone had been posting strange comments on a professional networking forum. Claims that our firm had a culture of betrayal, that certain employees had sabotaged a superior out of jealousy. I brushed it off at first. Anonymous posts meant nothing in a world full of noise. Then I saw the username, Market Exec, Clarice. She hadn't changed at all, still grasping for control, still rewriting the story to make herself the victim. At first, I ignored it. I told myself that feeding into her drama would only give her power. But when clients started mentioning the posts, asking if there had been some kind of scandal, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. I printed out every screenshot, every slanderous comment, every thread where she implied I was a manipulative receptionist who stole her position. The irony almost made me laugh. After all, wasn't that exactly what she had done to me? I walked straight to HR this time, not as the humiliated employee begging to be heard, but as a leader demanding accountability. Linda looked startled when I placed the folder on her desk. "What's this?" "Defamation," I said flatly. "From a former employee targeting me and the company. If this continues, it could damage our reputation." She flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing. "Is this Clarice?" I nodded. "She's using professional networks to smear both me and the firm. I need this handled properly." Linda didn't hesitate this time. Within hours, legal was looped in. The company's attorney drafted a cease and desist letter that was sent directly to Clarice's new consulting email, the one she was using to post her stories. The response was immediate. Her posts vanished. Her profile disappeared, and for a brief moment, I thought it was done. But Clarice wasn't one to give up easily. A week later, I got an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "You think you won. Every instinct told me not to open it, but I did." It was her. The message was short and venomous. "You got lucky, Jenna. Don't forget you're still the girl who sat by the door. Without me, you'd still be there." I stared at the words, my pulse quickening. She wanted me angry. She wanted me to lash out, to respond, to prove her right. But I had learned too much to take that bait. So, I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded it to HR and the legal team. They documented it, contacted her lawyer, and warned her that any further harassment would lead to formal action. That was the last message I ever received from Clarice. After that, she vanished completely. Her LinkedIn profile went dark. Her name stopped circulating in industry circles. The woman who had once ruled my world with her cruelty had finally been silenced, not by rage, but by professionalism and truth. Still, the experience shook me. For days afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about how easily she'd slipped back into her old ways. Some people don't want redemption, they just want control. I realized then that revenge had limits. You can expose someone, destroy their power, even erase their influence, but you can't make them change. That's their choice, and Clarice had chosen bitterness. A few weeks later, I ran into Brianna at a networking event. She looked different, calmer, older somehow. She approached me hesitantly. "Jenna," she said softly. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. For everything. I didn't realize how bad it was until it all fell apart." I studied her face for a moment. There was no manipulation there, no pretense, just regret. "Thank you," I said finally. "I appreciate that." She nodded. "Clarice tried to reach out to me too, you know. Wanted me to help her tell her side of the story. I didn't answer. That made me smile. Just a little. Good, she's not your problem anymore." As I walked away from that conversation, I felt something strange, a sense of finality. Clarice was no longer a presence in my life. She was a lesson, not a threat. Back at the office, I shared none of this with my team. They didn't need to know. What mattered was keeping the peace we had built. I focused on the work, the people, and the future we were shaping together. But late one evening, as I packed up to leave, I caught my reflection in the office door, the same door that once symbolized humiliation and exclusion. I smiled faintly. Clarice's voice no longer lived in my head. Her words no longer held weight. I had taken back every piece of dignity she tried to strip from me, and I finally knew she'd never be part of my world again. Freedom doesn't come from revenge, it comes from reclaiming your voice. 6 months after, Clarice's final attempt to rattle me, the company I had once feared walking into every morning became a place I genuinely loved. The walls no longer echoed with cruel laughter or whispered gossip. People talked openly now about ideas, about projects, about their lives. There was lightness where there used to be dread. I had officially been promoted to department head. The announcement came in a short, simple email from Mr. Hawthorne. Effective immediately. Jenna Miller will assume the permanent role of marketing director. I stared at that line for a long time. It wasn't about the title or the pay raise, it was about what it represented. I had walked in as the invisible girl by the door, and now I was leading the very department that once tried to bury me. When I moved into the office, officially my office, it still carried ghosts of Clarice's reign. Her old furniture gleamed, her scent faintly lingered on the air. It didn't feel like mine yet, so I started small. The first thing I did was take down her framed certificates. There were so many awards for leadership excellence and outstanding team performance. Every one of them was built on someone else's effort, someone else's pain. I stacked them neatly in a box and replaced them with something simple. A single mirror. Every day when I walked into that office, I looked at that mirror and reminded myself, this is who did the work. This is who survived. That reflection was my medal. Then I set new rules, real ones, not the unspoken hierarchies that once defined this place. No one would ever be dismissed for speaking up. No ideas would be stolen, no voices silenced. We started implementing peer recognition programs where employees nominated each other for their contributions. And unlike before, we didn't just reward results, we rewarded respect, teamwork, and integrity. The difference was instant. The office buzzed with creativity again. Teams laughed in brainstorming sessions, argued passionately about strategies, and celebrated small victories together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. One afternoon, during a department meeting, a young analyst nervously raised her hand. "I think we should try a softer marketing tone," she said. "Less sales-driven, more emotional connection." Her voice trembled. I saw a younger version of myself in her, the one who had once spoken up and been laughed at. "That's a great idea," I said warmly. "Let's test it in the next campaign." Her relief was visible. Her colleagues nodded in agreement, and I knew that tiny moment mattered more than any project deadline we'd ever hit. As months passed, the department's reputation transformed. What had once been known as a toxic team became the model for the entire company. Mr. Hawthorne began inviting me to senior strategy meetings, asking for my input on broader company policies. For the first time, my voice shaped decisions that affected hundreds of people. And yet, through it all, I never forgot where I came from. Some mornings, I'd arrive early and sit by the main door for a few minutes, the same spot where it all began. New hires would walk past, smiling nervously, clutching their coffee cups and folders just like I used to. I made it a point to greet each one personally. "Welcome," I'd say with a smile. "You're going to do great here." It wasn't just politeness. It was rewriting history. The door that had once symbolized exclusion now stood as a reminder of transformation. One day, one of our interns, a bright young woman named Harper, asked me why I sometimes sat by the door before meetings. I smiled. Because every good leader needs to remember what it feels like to be on the outside looking in. She nodded slowly, as if storing that sentence away. And I hoped she would. Because leadership isn't about control, it's about empathy. Nolan often joked that I'd become the company's conscience. Maybe he was right. Whenever a decision risked being unfair, people turned to me for perspective. Not because I had authority, but because they trusted my fairness. That was my quiet victory. On my 1-year anniversary as director, the company threw a small celebration. There was cake, laughter, and even a toast from Mr. Hawthorne. "To Jenna," he said, raising his glass, "for proving that true leadership starts with grace under pressure." Everyone clapped, and I smiled, though my heart was somewhere else. After the party, when the office emptied, I walked back into my office and stood before the mirror I'd hung on that first day. My reflection stared back, older, wiser, and unbroken. I thought of the girl who once sat by the door, afraid to take up space. She was still with me, but now she was standing tall. The next morning, as sunlight poured through the windows, I wrote a simple note and pinned it beside the mirror. "No one gets sidelined here. Ever again." The rule was simple, but it carried everything I had fought for. Now, when people passed my office, they didn't whisper about the door girl. They came in to brainstorm, laugh, vent, and dream. The room that once bred fear now built futures. And every time someone new joined the team, they learned the story not of revenge, but of renewal. The cycle was broken. But I still carried the lessons and the scars like armor. Closure doesn't always come how you expect it. A full year had passed since Clarice's name had last been spoken inside the company. Time had softened the edges of those memories, turning them from pain into quiet wisdom. I'd stopped thinking about her entirely, or at least, I thought I had until the letter arrived. It was a Tuesday morning, ordinary in every way. I was sorting through mail on my desk, half distracted by a campaign deadline, when I saw it. A plain white envelope with no return address, but my name written across the front, in careful, looping handwriting. The kind of handwriting that used to scrawl across memos left on my desk years ago. I froze. For a moment, I just stared at it, my heart beating in my throat. Then, slowly, I slid a letter opener along the seal and unfolded the single page inside. The first line confirmed what I already knew. "Jenna, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to say what I should have said a long time ago." It was from Clarice. I sat back in my chair and read every word. She wrote about how she'd lost everything: her job, her reputation, her sense of identity. How she'd gone through months of therapy and realized how much damage she'd done, not just to me, but to everyone who ever worked under her. She didn't try to justify her actions. She didn't blame stress or pressure or office politics. She just admitted it. "I made you small because I couldn't stand how small I felt inside. I see that now." She wrote that she had spent a long time being angry at me, at the company, at herself, and that she'd finally realized that anger was what had destroyed her. "You were stronger than I gave you credit for. I thought you were beneath me, but you were the only one brave enough to see the truth." By the time I reached the end of the letter, my hands were trembling. "You don't owe me forgiveness, but I needed to acknowledge the pain I caused. You didn't just survive me, you became everything I pretended to be." I hope, someday, you find peace in knowing that. I read that last line over and over, the words blurring as tears welled in my eyes. I wasn't angry anymore, just stunned. Clarice, the woman who once relished in my humiliation, had written an apology. A real one. I placed the letter down on my desk and just sat there, staring at it. For so long, I had imagined what I would say to her if I ever saw her again. I'd imagined triumph, anger, closure on my terms. But this wasn't revenge. This was something deeper. That night, I took the letter home. I made a cup of tea, sat by my living room window, and read it again under the dim glow of the lamp. Outside, the city lights shimmered constant, indifferent, alive. I realized then that I didn't need to respond. Sometimes, silence is forgiveness. I didn't want to reopen old wounds. I didn't want to relive the pain. Clarice's letter wasn't about her asking for redemption, it was her giving me permission to stop carrying her in my mind. The next morning, I slid the letter into a small box I kept in my bottom drawer, the same box that held a few mementos from my early days at the firm. My first company badge labeled receptionist, a cracked pen, a faded notepad. And now, her letter. I didn't keep it because I wanted to remember her. I kept it because it marked the end of something that had once defined me. Weeks later, during a staff meeting, I found myself sharing something personal with my team. You know, I said, we all go through moments where we're underestimated by others, by life, even by ourselves. But the moment you decide you deserve to be seen, everything changes. They nodded, listening intently. They didn't know where the words came from, but I did. It came from the journey, the pain, the revenge, and yes, even the apology I never expected to receive. After the meeting, I walked back to my office and paused by the mirror on the wall. My reflection met my eyes, calm and steady. There was no anger left. No lingering resentment. Only gratitude for surviving. For growing. For refusing to become like the people who tried to destroy me. That afternoon, as I sat at my desk, I felt an odd sense of peace settle over me. I didn't forgive Clarice because she asked me to. I forgave her because I no longer needed her shadow to measure my light. Her letter was proof that people can change, but also that I no longer needed them to, for my own healing to be complete. Before leaving that evening, I opened the drawer, glanced at the letter one last time, and whispered, "Thank you." Not for what she did, but for what she taught me. The girl by the door had finally stepped into her own light. Every ending I gave them became the beginning of my own story. Years have passed since those days when I sat by the door, shrinking beneath the weight of other people's laughter. I'm 35 now. The woman I am today wouldn't even recognize the girl I used to be. But every time I think I've left that part of my life behind, I'll catch a glimpse of a glass door or a flicker of fluorescent light and remember exactly how it felt to be small, to be unseen, to be waiting for permission to matter. Those memories don't hurt anymore. They remind me who I am. After Clarice's letter, life unfolded in ways I could never have imagined. I didn't just stay at the company, I transformed it. Within 3 years, our marketing division became the firm's most profitable department. The systems I built, fairness audits, anonymous reporting channels, leadership training, were adopted company-wide. We didn't just repair a workplace, we rewrote the definition of one. When the CEO announced a partnership with a national business ethics organization, he mentioned me by name. "Jenna Miller turned pain into policy," he said. It was surreal hearing those words, but I didn't feel pride so much as peace. The work wasn't about recognition. It was about preventing anyone else from being silenced by someone like Clarice ever again. Eventually, though, I knew it was time to move on. Growth requires new rooms, new doors. I left the firm with grace, handing the reins to the next generation of leaders I'd mentored. That's how my consulting firm was born. I called it The Way Out. It started small, just me, Nolan, and 2 laptops in a co-working space downtown. But our mission was clear: to help women rebuild after toxic workplaces, to teach companies how to spot abuse before it starts, and to remind survivors that being underestimated can be the sharpest tool in the box. At first, it was slow. Few corporations wanted to admit they needed help fixing their culture. Then, stories began pouring in emails from women who'd endured humiliation, dismissal, and gaslighting just like I had. Some were secretaries, some were executives. All of them had been made to sit metaphorically by the door. We started coaching them one by one, helping them rebuild confidence and strategy. Soon after, we began speaking at conferences, universities, and leadership panels. Each time I stood on a stage, looking out at faces filled with quiet recognition, I told them the truth. They may try to sit you by the door, but you decide when to walk out. Those words became our motto. They appeared on every brochure, every workshop, every email signature. It wasn't just a phrase, it was a movement. Nolan and I grew the firm into something bigger than either of us could have imagined. He handled the tech, the systems, the back-end logistics. I handled the people, their stories, their fears, their rebirths. Over time, our partnership deepened into something stronger than friendship. Respect became affection. Affection became love. We didn't rush it, it just evolved. Two people who had once fought side by side against injustice now built something beautiful together. One afternoon, after finishing a seminar in New York, Nolan turned to me and said, "Do you realize you've become the person you needed back then?" The question stopped me cold. I hadn't thought about it that way, but he was right. Every woman I mentored, every company I challenged, every voice I amplified, it was all for that younger version of myself who once sat by the door, praying someone would notice her worth. I finally understood that revenge had never truly been the point. Transformation was. Sometimes, I drive past my old office on State Street. The firm is still there, but the faces have changed. The glass door that once slammed behind me now reflects sunlight in a way that feels softer, almost forgiving. I park across the street for a moment, not to gloat, not to reminisce, but to smile. That place doesn't define me anymore. I outgrew it. The seat by the door that once symbolized humiliation became the foundation of everything I built. It taught me resilience, empathy, and the kind of quiet power that doesn't need validation. I walk through many doors now, conference halls, corporate boardrooms, universities, filled with young women eager to change the world, and each time I do, I think of that first one, the one they sat me beside. The one they thought would keep me in my place. They were right about one thing. That door did define me, just not in the way they expected. Now, whenever I end my speeches, I always close with the same line. It's simple, but it always lands. I used to sit by the door so everyone could see me as they walked in. Now, I stand by the door so I can show others the way out. And every time I say it, I feel the room shift, the quiet ripple of understanding, the nods from people who know exactly what it means to rise from invisibility. My journey started in a corner seat where I was meant to disappear. It ended in rooms where my words make others visible. That, to me, is the ultimate revenge, not their downfall, but my evolution. I no longer carry the bitterness, only the lesson. The door they made me sit beside is no longer a reminder of pain, it's a symbol of power. Because for me, doors aren't walls anymore, they're choices. And every choice I make now is one that opens something new. Because I didn't just show them the way out, I showed myself the way forward.